In this video in the web development tutorial series, we'll look at the ID and class attributes that we can apply to HTML elements. If we go to the W3 Schools page for the ID attribute, it'll tell us that the ID attribute specifies a unique ID for an HTML element. The value of the ID attribute must be unique within the HTML document. The ID attribute is used to point to a specific style declaration in a style sheet, and it can also be used by JavaScript to access and manipulate the specific element in the document with that specific ID. The class attribute is often used to point to a class name in a style sheet. It can also be used by JavaScript to access and manipulate multiple elements in the document that have the same class name. So an ID must be unique, and an ID attribute name can only be applied to a single element in the document. A class attribute name can be applied to multiple elements in the same document. To validate this, we can go to Visual Studio Code, grab all the HTML that we've written in the index.html file, go back to the browser, and search for the new HTML checker. You click on this link, it'll bring us to the HTML validation service. Because we've copied our HTML and put it in the clipboard, we could select text input from the dropdown and then replace the default text with the text from our HTML file. If I then click the check button, it'll run a syntax validator against my HTML, and it tells me that my document has passed validation. Now, if we go to the div tag and I give this div an ID equal to first div, and we'll copy this, and if I scroll down to the second div and I give this an ID attribute of second div, and I click the check button, we still pass validation. That's because the ID attribute value names are unique. However, if I were to take the same name for the first div ID and paste it into the second and run the validator, now our validation will fail because we'll get a duplicate ID error message in the code. And if we scroll down, it'll show us where the issue is. So, this is an excellent tool for you to use to validate your HTML as you write your code. I highly recommend going to this page and bookmarking it. Now, if we come up here to the first div and change the ID attribute to a class attribute, and then we come down to the second div and change that ID attribute to a class attribute, and then run the validator, we're back to passing the syntax validation. Because even though the values are the same, first div and first div, this will pass because class names can be reused by multiple elements in the document. It's the ID attribute value that must be unique. Remember, the ID is a unique identifier for a specific HTML element in the document. With that knowledge in mind, let's return to our index file and add some ID attributes. First, I'll find the div which wraps the description and give this an ID attribute with a value of description. Then I'll collapse the div which wraps our nested planet list to give us a little more space to work with. I'll find the span which wraps the link to Wikipedia and give this an ID attribute with a value of wiki. If I save the file and revisit the page, we'll see that nothing's changed. All we've done is added an ID attribute and value to two divs on the page. In order to apply a change which will affect the content wrapped in those divs, we need to write some CSS which will apply this style. So let's go back to our code, go up to the head, and we'll add a style block. And the style block is what we use to write CSS, or cascading style sheets, directly in the HTML page. Now, the HTML elements are used to define the structure of the page. What content do we want on the page and where do we want it? Styles or CSS, is used to define the look and feel of the content on the page. So although we won't be diving deep into CSS until the next playlist in this tutorial series, we will write a little bit of CSS inside of this style block to show one of the benefits of using the ID and class attributes. So when applying CSS to our HTML elements, we could do it in one of three ways. The first is to reference the HTML element directly. So if I wanted to change the color of the text wrapped inside any paragraph on our page, I would start my style by typing the element, which in our case is a P, and then the syntax requires curly braces. So find the HTML elements with a P, so all paragraphs, and give them a color of blue, and end with a semicolon. If I were to save this, go back to the browser, we'll now see our description is in blue text. And this style is applied to any text wrapped within a paragraph tag. So if I were to take this text and let's say go down beneath our list of planets and paste it in here, save it, go back to the browser, and this text is in blue as well. Not simply because I copied the text, but because it's wrapped in a paragraph tag. If we were to change the paragraph tag simply to a line break, save it, now the text is no longer blue because it's not wrapped in a paragraph. So let's clean this up, go back to the top, and let's modify this so that the color blue is not applied to all text wrapped within paragraphs in our page, but to a specific tag on the page. And we can do that by targeting the ID attribute of a specific HTML element, because the ID is unique to one element on the page. So what we're doing here is we'll take description and replace the paragraph tag with the ID that we want to target. So this is saying, hey CSS, I want you to go find the single HTML element on the page which has an ID of description and change its color to blue. So if we save this, go back to our page, we're kind of surprised in that the color of the text isn't blue. Well, that's because we need to add a character here which tells CSS, hey, we're not looking for an HTML element because description isn't a valid HTML element, but we're looking for an ID. And the way that we do that is by prepending the ID name with the hashtag. And the hashtag tells CSS, I want you to find the element with the ID of description. If we save this and go back, now our text is blue. If we scroll down, remember we also added an ID to the span for Wikipedia. So if I want to target that element, again I'll use the # for the ID, and I'll add the ID itself, and curly braces will give this a color of red. Save the page, go back to the browser, and now the Wikipedia link is red. So that's how, by using the ID attribute and the # in CSS, to apply a style directly to a single element on a page. If we'd like to write a style that's applied to multiple elements on the page, we can use the class attribute. Now, when I say apply to multiple elements on the page, I'm not referring to when we added the HTML elements itself and said, hey, go find all the elements on the page that are paragraph tags and apply this style. Using a class, we can apply the same style to different elements. It doesn't matter what type of HTML element we're targeting. What's important is the value of the class attribute that's applied to the element itself. So if I were to add a new class of highlight and give it a background color of yellow, I could then apply class attributes with the value of highlight to any element on the page that I want to have a background color of yellow with a text color of blue. So let's go back to our element with the ID and description and change it from ID to class and change the value to highlight. We'll copy this, scroll down to the wiki span, give this the same class, and then save the page. If we go back to the browser, again, we're a little surprised, where the paragraph text is black and the link to Wikipedia is black as well. Well, similar to how we had to add the pound sign for CSS to be able to indicate I want this style applied to the HTML element with the ID of, well, in this case it would be highlight. In order to target a class, we use the period. And since we no longer need the ID attribute wiki style, we could delete that. Now with the period and the value of highlight, this style with the background color of yellow and the text color of blue should be applied to this div with a class of highlight and this span with a class of highlight. So let's go back to the page, and now we see that the text for the description and the link for Wikipedia are highlighted. So in this video, we added ID and class attributes to HTML elements and applied styles by using the CSS selectors, directly attaching the style to an HTML element, as well as to an element with a specific ID, and as well to elements with a shared class. In the next video, we'll look at the HTML anchor tag.